Hello, and welcome to the Serial Talker Podcast. I'm Peter Von Gomm. On STP, we love crime that passes the test of time. And today's story is absolutely no exception. We're turning back the clocks to 1964. It was an age of innocence. Not the age of innocence, but perhaps an age of innocence compared to today. Humans were making strides towards space travel. Tokyo was hosting the 18th Summer Olympics. Boxer Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, became the heavyweight champion of the world. And the Beatles were rocking America. Meanwhile, in New York City, three young surfer dudes from Miami with a very storied criminal past were rocking designer suits, looking for their next big hit. These wild thrill seekers would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, including a brazen break-in to get a stash of priceless gems. Let's get into it, shall we? On the evening of October 29th, 1964, three high-spirited Miami surfers, bored with preying on wealthy divorcees and tourists, pulled off one of the most audacious jewel heists in history. Like savvy Spider-Men, they scaled the 120-foot stone walls of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and broke in through an open window, looting priceless gems from the J.P. Morgan Hall of Gems collection. For several months, New York City and the world was transfixed by the brazen robbery that the tabloids immediately labeled the heist of the century. The young thieves were not only adept at riding the waves of Miami, but also at spotting easy and immensely lucrative targets. These beach boys got around. In the thieves' grab bag was the milky blue Star of India, the size of a golf ball and the world's biggest sapphire, weighing 563.35 carats. The orchid red DeLong Star ruby, 100.32 carats, and considered the world's most perfect. And the purplish blue Midnight Star, the largest black sapphire, at 116 carats. And coming in fourth place, the rare 16.25 carat Eagle Diamond, one of the largest ever found in the continental United States, plus fistfuls of diamonds and emeralds from old JP's proud collection. The culprits were not ordinary thieves. They were sharply dressed, tanned surfer dudes on a spree that took them from their base in Miami Beach up to their lair in New York City, a penthouse suite in a Manhattan hotel. They were caught within 2 days of the crime, but the jewels remained missing long after. After a wild escapade in Miami, an unorthodox excursion involving a rented convertible, many of the gems were recovered, including the Star of India, which was promptly put on solo display, alone, in the museum's main floor rotunda, this time with its own security detail and safe. The heist became the basis for the 1975 film Murph the Surf. In it, the true characters of this story, Jack Murphy and Alan Kuhn, were played by actors Don Stroud and Robert Conrad, respectively. Murphy and Kuhn dress in sharp suits and accompany stylish ladies into the Hall of Gems to case the joint, noticing the fourth-floor windows were left open. Here's a little background on our three thieves. Jack Murphy, Alan Kuhn, and Roger Clark were tan, fit beach boys in their 20s, full of swagger and rat-pack chic. They had driven up from Miami several weeks earlier in a white Cadillac and had settled into a penthouse suite at the Cambridge House Hotel on West 86th Street, where they threw constant parties. All the while, they were pulling off smaller robberies around town of hotel rooms and wealthy bar patrons. But it was hard to ignore the museum's world-class jewel exhibit beckoning them a few blocks away. In scouting the hall, they realized that, for a skilled thief with the chutzpah to break in, the jewels were practically begging to be stolen, recalled Jack Murphy in a recent interview. His partner, Alan Kuhn, said he could hear the jewels talking. The jewels were saying, "Take us to Miami." So, well, they took him to Miami. While Kuhn was eager for the museum heist, Murphy recalled being initially leery of the caper. They were turning heads, and too many people in town knew who they were. Their spree began as a game, a way to rebel against society. It was never about the money, supposedly, but rather the thrill of the chase. Jack Murphy, a.k.a. Murph the Surf, as he came to be known in the tabloids, grew up in Southern California during the formative years of longboard surfing, which he helped pioneer on the East Coast in the 1950s by opening a shop in Florida. He grew up with two strangely contrasting passions, the violin and surfing. He dropped out of college as a freshman in the mid-1950s and hitched a ride to Miami, where he taught tennis and swimming at swanky hotels, also performing as a trick diver in the hotel aquatic shows. By 1957, he was married, and 5 years and 2 sons later was married again. Seeking to capitalize on his fame as a championship surfer, he moved with his second wife to Cocoa Beach and opened a surfboard store. With his second marriage unraveling, Murphy returned to Miami Beach, where he fell in with the local hustlers and thieves who robbed mansions along the Intercoastal Waterway. They relied on Murphy's special talent. He would swim the jewels to a getaway car on the mainland. A year before the Star of India heist, Murphy was still a world-class surfer, taking first place in a competition in Virginia Beach that was a precursor to the East Coast Surfing Championships. But by the time he arrived in New York that autumn, he was also a hardened jewel thief, fresh off a streak of heists of mansions and hotels in Miami. One night, he joined friends on a boat ride to rob a mansion, earning a quick $15,000 as his share of the proceeds. The easy money was irresistible. The decision to try the museum job was hardly the result of an elaborate scheme. Instead, it was almost a whim after a drinking session at a hotel bar. Murphy was ready for anything. Alan Kuhn was raised in West Grove, Missouri. His father abandoned the family when he was a toddler, and his mother worked part-time jobs to support Kuhn and his baby sister. As a 15-year-old, Kuhn was arrested for breaking into neighbors' homes and sentenced to probation. In contrast, his partner in crime, Jack Murphy, as a 15-year-old, played violin with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra and won a tennis scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh. After a semester at Southern Illinois University, Kuhn enlisted in the Navy and saw the world via submarine. When his tour of duty ended in 1962, he headed for Miami Beach, landing a job as a swimming instructor at the Casablanca Hotel, an Art Deco classic on Collins Drive. How did he go from law-abiding citizen to a life of crime? Well, one night a bartender took him into a back room where a local jewel thief was nursing a graze from a bullet. The man told Kuhn that he had just been shot by a police officer while trying to rob a coin store. He dared Kuhn to finish the job. Kuhn, being the adventurous type and not one to pass on a dare, climbed up the building and found the hole in the roof the coin thief had cut. He went down a rope and cleaned the place out. The thrill, the rush. He had been earning $100 a day with tips at the Casablanca. A few days later, he was handed an envelope containing $180,000 in cash. That's how he went from law-abiding citizen to a life of crime. The third player in this dynamic trio, the lookout guy. No posse of thieves is complete without a cool-headed lookout. This is where Roger Clark enters the fray. Murphy and Kuhn recruited house painter Roger Clark to join their naughty crew. A native of Meridian, Connecticut, Clark had been a high school lifeguard before joining the Navy. After finishing his service, he briefly tried the 9-to-5 life at a Connecticut chemical factory and then headed for Miami, where he took on gigs as a jack of all trades. Tempted by the lure of easy money, the sweet Clark got in over his head. Clark played the extra man, watching out for the police or driving the getaway car. He was a backup guy. Roger was real quiet, real cool, very calm. A perfect complement to the axis of thieves. Murphy and Kuhn, who had mutual friends, soon began working together to plunder the city. A bellman or a manicurist might tip them off that a tourist had left her room. A crooked insurance agent might know which rich locals had upped jewelry riders. They amassed a collection of master keys from many of the hotels. As jewel thieves, they were not subtle. They'd do a job and then hit the Miami bars that night, reading about their escapades in newspapers the next morning, not long before everyone knew. Kuhn initially kept a low profile until Murphy initiated him into the good life, upgrading to a stylish apartment and a white Cadillac, a speedboat, and sailboat. The money came and went. The ambitious thieves began to show up as large blips on Florida law enforcement radar. They were questioned for several robberies and arrested, getting sprung with the help of local mob lawyer Harvey St. Jean. By the fall of 1964, the authorities in Miami appeared to be closing in. The FBI were trailing Kuhn and Murphy for 6 months. Leaving town for New York City seemed to be a prudent decision. Murphy and Kuhn split town and headed to New York City in Kuhn's white Cadillac. They checked into the Stanhope Hotel, where they were joined by Clark a few days later. The tanned and well-muscled men stood out in Manhattan, especially Kuhn, who favored colorful Florida attire, looking like a Shriners Convention attendee. Argyle socks, a yellow jacket, a fancy shirt. Fearful of standing out, Murphy wisely told him to lose the flash and get a dark suit. Seeking more affordable housing, they settled into Cambridge House Hotel on West 86th Street, and the party began. They made a memorable impression on the Cambridge House staff, throwing raucous parties at their penthouse suite, dragging new friends out of jazz clubs and back to their pad for nightcaps and more. Uber Eats wouldn't be around for another 60 years, so they tipped bellboys handsomely, $100 for delivering takeout and liquor to their room. They were having a ball in New York City. It was 1964 and the World's Fair was on. They visited museums, ate at upscale restaurants, and frequented the hottest clubs. But it was a visit to the American Museum of Natural History that became the impetus for their grand theft. The three of them visited the museum multiple times, staking the place and making mental notes. They hid to see when the guards came around for their change of shift. Once, even escorting fashionable dates for a tour of the Hall of Gems. They were mesmerized by the stones, donated by the billionaire J.P. Morgan in 1901. Morgan had hired Tiffany's gemologist George Frederick Kunz to put together the collection. The Blue Star of India had been mined in Ceylon 300 years before, and at 563 carats, it was the size of a golf ball. The Eagle Diamond was discovered in 1876 by a farmer in Wisconsin. Socialite Edith Hagen DeLong, the daughter of a copper magnate, had subsequently given the museum a gorgeous red cabochon-cut ruby, unearthed in Burma in the early 1930s. It was game time. The supplies were purchased, the plans were finalized, and then Murphy got cold feet. He worried that they had been indiscreet, too many parties, too many people knew, but Kuhn was adamant. It had to be done. On the night of Thursday, October 29th, the Beach Boys hotel suite was quiet. Clark drove the Cadillac to the back of the museum, dropping off his partners, and remained behind the wheel with a walkie-talkie. Murphy was dressed sharp, in a dark green velour jacket, turtleneck, corduroys, and tennis shoes. With the exception of the sneakers, he would have fit right in at the hottest 60s New York clubs. After all, if you're going to pull off a spectacular heist, you got to have a little flair. Kuhn with an airline shoulder bag and a coil of rope, and Murphy carrying a pistol just in case, clambered like acrobats over a spiked steel fence into a courtyard. The next challenge was to ascend the 125-foot museum wall. Not a problem for these pros. Their skill, athleticism, and years of experience in cat burglary would soon pay off. Kuhn climbed up until he reached a ledge, and then lowered a rope for Murphy, who pulled himself up. After Murphy reached the ledge, He almost fell after he startled a covey of pigeons that burst into flight. They climbed the fire escape to the 5th floor and inched along a narrow ledge. From there, they lowered themselves to an open window in the 4th floor Hall of Gems. Easing open the window, the pair entered the darkened office of Dr. Colin Turnbull, a noted British anthropologist of the day. From there, they slipped into the J.P. Morgan Hall of Gems and Minerals. With 25-foot ceilings and a metal gate locking it off from the rest of the museum, the room was isolated and pristine. They sat there for a while, giddy and in awe. They couldn't believe that they had made it in undetected. They waited, making sure no guards were coming into the exhibit space. They never did. They got to work, using glass cutters to score a circle which they covered with duct tape to prevent shattering and muffle the sound. Timing their work with the guards' predictable rounds in the greater museum, they worked carefully over several hours, hitting one case after another, synchronizing the smashing with airliners flying overhead and sweeping the floor after each one. The most precious gems were in larger cases in the center of the room, but the alarms had been non-functional for years. When they lifted out the gems, the room remained eerily silent. They were certain there were alarms, but nothing was tripped. It appeared the wire on the alarms had been disconnected, and the museum staff scarcely monitored the valuables. Until that night, the jewels had been laying there untouched and undisturbed for 70 years. They could see that the trip alarm on the Star of India's display stand had batteries that were corroded and probably long dead. The plan in place was that when the Star of India's alarm went off, they'd just run for it. But nothing happened. Surf's up. A seemingly impossible caper was turning out to be a summer breeze. Around midnight, after gathering up roughly 24 jewels, prize emeralds, diamonds, aquamarines, and several diamond bracelets, brooches, and rings, they went back out the window and climbed down to the ground. No one heard or saw the thieves as they slipped back into the night. When Murphy walked through the small park around the museum, he saw a crowd of police officers and froze. He quickly realized that this was not a response to the robbery, but rather a routine beat from the local precinct. Still, here he was, carrying a bag of stolen jewels, a coil of rope on his shoulder, when 2 officers headed toward him. "Good evening, officers." They nodded. He then hailed a cab on Columbus Avenue, not to the penthouse suite to stash the hot load he had in his bag. No, that would be too predictable and routine. The driver took him to the Metropole Cafe to check out Gene Krupa's jazz band. Minutes after pulling off a most epic heist, Murph the Surf was standing with the jewels and a cocktail at the Metropole, grooving to Krupa's star trumpeter, Shorty Rogers. At 9:15 a.m. the next morning, Kuhn and Murphy boarded an Eastern Airlines flight from JFK to Miami, traveling under assumed names and toting a yellow case containing their booty. Shortly before 10 a.m., while in the air, museum guard John Hoffman unlocked the gates to the J.P. Morgan Hall of Gems to find it a complete wreck, with numerous display cases shattered, the cabinets broken, and their contents pillaged. He was so distraught that his frantic call to the police was incomprehensible. Of the 8 guards on duty that night to cover the 18-building museum complex, it was the responsibility of one aging guard to sporadically shine a flashlight into the Hall of Gems during his rounds. Clearly, that wasn't enough. All the top authorities rushed to the scene. The district commander, the borough chief, the police commissioner, cops and reporters swarmed the building. Fearful reporters' fingerprints might spoil the crime scene. A battalion of cops kept them at bay. At an acrimonious press conference, museum director Dr. James Oliver blamed the poor security on city budget cuts and admitted that the missing gems were not insured, saying, "You can't take items such as these, which are priceless, and insure them." Lead detective Jack McNally of NYPD took on what would be a career-making case. By the time the bulletins went out, Murphy and Coon had arrived in Miami. Murphy's girlfriend picked them up at the airport and drove them back to Coon's apartment. They pulled the curtains tight, took the stones out, and rolled them on the carpet. Illuminating them with a flashlight, the facets of the sapphires looked like shooting stars, exploding with beams of light. In Manhattan, the following evening, Vice Squad Detective James Walsh was patrolling the Upper West Side when he was waved over by the front desk clerk of the Cambridge House Hotel. The employee confided, "There's 3 guys in this place who are spending money like madmen." In the end, it was their high living that ultimately brought them down. Detectives secured a search warrant and went to Cambridge House to investigate the tip. In the hotel suite, they discovered sneakers embedded with glass, photos of several museums, burglary tools, scales, and a few packets of heroin. Curious to see if anyone would return, Detective Jack McNally spent the night in the penthouse. The next morning, Clark, who had driven to Connecticut to visit his family, returned, accompanied by a male friend. When they came into the apartment, they caught Detective McNally with his pants down, literally. He was in the bathroom just finishing up. He rushed to grab his gun and shield, and then told them they were under arrest. At the local precinct house, the police pressed Clark about his whereabouts. For a while, he denied any complicity or any knowledge of the burglary of the museum. But after some pressing and applied psychology, he made a full confession to the part he played and implicated Coon and Murphy as his accomplices. Clark later claimed in a deposition aimed to quash his confession that he'd been a victim of police brutality, claiming he was beaten and assaulted by one of the cops, apparently kicking him with his booted feet and struck and jabbed him with his nightstick. Indicted on charges of drug possession and possession of burglary tools, Clark pled not guilty and was released on $12,000 bond. The Manhattan police contacted their Miami counterparts for assistance in the case. A plan was put into order and 8 lawmen burst into Coon's apartment. Murphy was there, but Coon had run out for an errand. He returned to find his home under siege. The FBI turned the place upside down in search of the gems, but he had hidden the jewels in the hallway outside his apartment, overhead in the ceiling. Murphy and Coon spent several nights in a Miami jail, charged with interstate transportation of stolen property. Upon being released on bail, the duo gave a wisecracking press conference in the office of lawyer Harvey St. Jean. Feeling the heat after the raid on his apartment, Coon entrusted the stash of gems to a former co-conspirator, Dickie Pearson, hoping for honor among thieves, and buried the stones in his backyard. It was a decision that he would regret. A few weeks later, masked men burst into Pearson's house, demanded the jewels, and pistol-whipped Pearson, but supposedly left empty-handed. The 3 were then extradited to Manhattan to face charges of first-degree burglary and possession of burglary tools. But oddly, the villains in this high-profile case became the sweethearts of the tabloids. The 3 of them, including Clark, were treated like celebrities. These were the bad guys, but the papers had played them as heroes. The crowds cheered them as they walked by. The circumstantial evidence pointed to their guilt, but without the missing jewels, it was hard to make a case. Freed once again on bail, the Beach Boys returned to Miami. They would fly up to New York for court dates and never missed an opportunity to grandstand for the press and insult the authorities as bumbling buffoons. Enter prosecutor Maurice Najari. He was astonished by the public reaction to these 3. Najari was a by-the-books prosecutor and a fierce cross-examiner. His regular courtroom was known among opposing defense attorneys as the snake pit. He saw the jewel theft as an affront to the city itself and felt that those jewels belonged to the people of New York City. To pressure the thieves, Najari began to reinvestigate cold cases in Manhattan and asked the Miami police for leads. Just when the case appeared to be going nowhere, Najari hit publicity pay dirt. Researching unsolved Miami cases, he saw that Eva Gabor, yes, that Eva Gabor from Green Acres, and her husband, stockbroker Richard Brown, had been pistol whipped at the Racket Club in Miami in January of 1964, and her $25,000 diamond ring was stolen. Eva Gabor, who was in New York, picked the duo out of a lineup. Even though the crime had occurred in Florida, Najari convinced a New York jury to indict the thieves. At a hearing, Manhattan defense lawyer Gilbert Rosenthal argued that Kuhn's photo had been in practically every newspaper in the country, and that Gabor and her husband were trying to get into the publicity act. Gabor's status as a celebrity crime victim won her an appearance on Johnny Carson. The charges were later dropped after Gabor refused to turn up for trial, claiming that she was too busy filming Green Acres in L.A. Whether or not this pistol whipping and theft actually took place, it served its purpose. Najari was able to convince a prosecutor in New York to bring up the new charges, and hence raising bail to $150,000 each for the Beach Boys. Unable to come up with the money, the three men were extradited back to New York City and taken to Rikers Island to await trial for most certainly lengthy prison terms in the Tombs. Meanwhile, a handful of the stolen gems were busy exchanging hands in a fencing operation led by a character named Hi Gordon. Gordon and the boys go way back, doing clandestine biz from a myriad of thefts over the years. However, some of the gems from the museum theft were simply too hot to handle, like the Star of India. But the lesser-known jewels did get fenced, including the Eagle Diamond. It's assumed it was cut up into several smaller gems and never to be seen again. Back at Rikers with an unknown fate, Kuhn decided to cooperate in helping to recover the stolen jewels. One morning, prosecutor Najari got a call from the warden of Rikers Island saying, "A prisoner wants to see you." Kuhn wanted to talk. Najari felt they'd hit the jackpot. Kuhn offered to retrieve the stolen jewels in return for a lighter sentence. Najari agreed to recommend leniency. It was a risky ploy. The district attorney told Najari, "If you don't get the jewels, don't come back." That night, Kuhn, Najari, and three detectives, including Detective Jack McNally, flew to Miami. At the Florida airport, an audacious Kuhn balked at the sight of the black sedan rental car and insisted on a flashy red Cadillac, convertible. How could they say no? After all, Kuhn was in the driver's seat. During the trip, Kuhn repeatedly offered to bribe Najari to drop the charges or simply let him escape, offering, "All you have to do is turn your head away and I'll make you a rich man." Najari's allegiance to the case and strong conviction was steadfast. Kuhn led the law enforcement authorities all over Miami Beach, making hush-hush calls and hitting the bars for supposed meetings. He and his entourage were chased by dozens of reporters and the FBI. At one point, in order to avoid the tailing group of press and feds, Kuhn and his chaperones hopped out a rear motel window that had a long drop down to the beach. Kuhn refused at first until Najari told him to jump or be thrown out. Kuhn was impressed with Najari's skill in slipping in and out of motel windows, telling him he wished they'd met earlier, as he felt they would have made a great team as jewel thieves. At one point, Najari even put on a mask and snorkel to search for the jewels, which were said to be stashed underwater in Biscayne Bay near Kuhn's moored boat. Frustrated with Kuhn's stalling, the detectives invited the fence Hi Gordon out to dinner, agreeing he would do anything he could to help, as long as he didn't get involved in a conspiracy and subject himself to any prosecution. The breakthrough came with a 3 a.m. phone call to the hotel where Kuhn and the lawmen were staying. Fence Gordon picked up one of the detectives, and they drove to a hot shop. The unlikely pair went inside briefly, and when they returned to the car, they found a note, along with a key, directing them to a Trailways bus station and locker number 0911. Gordon quickly stuffed the incriminating note in his mouth and ate it. At the terminal, the detective retrieved 2 damp bags and returned to the hotel. When the contents of the grubby bags were spilled onto the coffee table at the hotel, Najari and the detectives felt elation at the sight of the Star of India, the Midnight Star, a sapphire, 5 emeralds, and 2 aquamarines. But Kuhn did a double take and nearly had a heart attack. The DeLong Star Ruby was missing. He speculated that his dirty pal Dickie Pearson had dug up the jewels earlier and grabbed the ruby. No one had thought to bring a case for the jewels, and all they could safely conceal them in was a sanitary napkin bag. One more hiccup. En route to the airport, their car broke down. They hiked to a payphone and called a local private detective, whose wife drove them onto the tarmac to a waiting plane. You can't make this stuff up, folks. On April 6, 1965, Alan Kuhn, Jack Murphy, and Roger Clark pled guilty to burglary and grand larceny. The Star of India becoming the star witness during the trial. To ensure its safety, the priceless gem was kept in a sealed lockbox, inside a safe, inside a wire-enclosed vault, inside a guarded and locked courthouse. Complaining that the thieves had not helped to retrieve the jewels, Najari asked for a 3-year sentence, and the judge agreed, sending them back to Rikers Island to serve their time. Stuck behind bars, the Beach Boys were furious with old Dickie Pearson. They felt he had shafted them. Murphy asked his Miami pals to send a message to Dick. They tied him up, roughed him up, and let him know Murphy didn't appreciate that he got more time in the slammer because he didn't return the ruby. The police were aware that Pearson had a shady reputation, but were unable to link him directly to the case. The sensational story and the surfer bud's notoriety faded from the headlines. But later that year, a Florida freelance writer by the name of Antel confronted Dickie Pearson about rumors that he had hawked the ruby to the Chicago underworld for a loan. Pearson hinted that he might be able to contact somebody who could get hold of the ruby, if there were a possibility of immunity, and he wanted a $25,000 reward. The journalist contacted the New York Daily News and promised the newspaper an exclusive as he continued to try to broker a deal in recovering the ruby. In the hopes of finding someone willing to pay a $25,000 ransom, Antel set up a meeting with billionaire insurance magnate John D. MacArthur. The philanthropist was famously frugal, yet he was intrigued by the missing ruby and agreed to pay the $25,000 ransom as he felt it was important enough to have the ruby returned to the museum and placed on view for everybody in the world to see. Once the scheme to swap the money for the ruby was arranged, a Daily News reporter and photographer went to Miami to capture the scene. On September 2, 1965, Antel picked up the ransom money from MacArthur at the First Marine Bank and later handed it over to Pearson. Waiting at the Colonnades Hotel late that night, MacArthur and the newspapermen got a call from Antel telling them to go to a service plaza on the Sunshine State Parkway. When they arrived, a payphone was ringing. The reporter answered. Relaying Pearson's instructions, Antel told the reporter to reach up over a ledge. I've got it, he announced. The photographer captured the moment. The front page of the next morning's Daily News read, "Here's Ruby, exclusive. Our man picks up ransom gem." But old Dickie Pearson couldn't keep his nose clean and was arrested several months later while burglarizing a jewelry store in Georgia, caught carrying a stack of $100 bills with serial numbers that matched the ransom money. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for his involvement in the DeLong Star Ruby case, a longer term than the thieves themselves received. With the DeLongs' return, 10 of the 24 most valuable gems were back in museum custody. The rest were never found. Now, what about all the remaining colorful characters in the Beach Boys saga? Well, High Gordon, the fence, was convicted for fencing other stolen gems and died of a heart attack in prison. The Florida attorney, Harvey St. Jean, remember the mob lawyer that got them off charges years earlier in Miami? He was gunned down in his Cadillac, a Miami underworld murder that still remains unsolved. Prosecutor Maurice Najari went on to a happier fate, named in 1972 by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller as a special prosecutor to investigate police corruption. To this day, he keeps a photo of the Star of India in his living room, a reminder of the most meaningful case of his career. The Cambridge House Hotel on West 86th Street, where the Surfer Dudes planned their caper, has now become a senior living center called the Atria. Roger Clark and Alan Kuhn went straight, fading into conventional lives. How boring. Kuhn, after complaining about insomnia to a local doctor, stumbled into a new line of work, growing medical marijuana, which was surprising to a man who had done jail time in the late 1960s for possession of a joint. His backyard crop providing a lucrative livelihood. Roger Clark became a bartender and golf pro. Settling near Mount Snow, Vermont, he spent 15 years working at a French restaurant, Le Petit Chef. Both Kuhn and Clark have died in recent years. But Jack Murphy's criminal career continued. In 1969, he was convicted in a murder case in Florida for his involvement in the deaths of 2 women who had fallen in with him and several other thieves. In December of 1967, 2 women's bikini-clad bodies were discovered submerged in the Whiskey Creek Canal, weighed down with concrete blocks. Murphy insisted that a shadowy figure named Rusty murdered the women. He admits that he helped dispose of the corpses, confessing, "It was an absolute nightmare. This was not part of the plan. Dead bodies in the back of my boat. You get rid of the situation the best you can." He was arrested, but since the evidence was initially circumstantial, was released on bail. Murphy then participated in one last flamboyant robbery at a waterfront mansion owned by Olive Wolford, a wealthy widow. Indicted for the Whiskey Creek murders and later for the mansion robbery, in March 1969, Murphy was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. And then, for good measure, the judge tacked on another life sentence for the robbery. His goose was cooked. Behind bars, Murphy developed a popular Christian ministry for inmates and was granted parole in the mid-1980s to administer prison outreach. He now lives in a small town near Tampa and continues his prison evangelism and still invokes the museum heist as the impetus for the criminal odyssey that ultimately led him to Jesus and redemption. Once a surfer, always a surfer. Murph the Surf still makes trips to Florida's East Coast to catch the occasional wave. And there you have it, folks. One of the greatest jewelry heists in history. I don't know about you guys, but the next time I'm in New York City, I'm definitely going to be hitting the American Museum of Natural History for a look at some of these gems, and maybe a jazz club or two. I'll bring my dark suit. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Serial Talker podcast. It's my pleasure to bring this to you weekly. If you like this kind of podcast, don't forget to subscribe. If you have an intriguing, compelling story you would like me to consider reading, definitely send me an email. That information is in the description. If you would like to help support the production costs of this podcast, you could always buy me a cup of coffee. Those details are also in the description. And finally, if you think a friend or two would enjoy the Serial Talker podcast, why not make their day? Please share. Thanks, guys. We'll see you again next week. Ciao for now.